Thank you for listening to the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast with host Clara and Jimmy Hinton. If you're new to the podcast, please subscribe and share so you never miss an episode. Search for us on your favorite podcast app, or you can find the podcast on jimmyhinton.org and findingahealingplace.com. Please rate our show, subscribe, and share so we can spread the word. If you would like to support us and get exclusive rewards, go to patreon.com/speakingout. Find a tier that best fits you and join as a patron of the podcast. Now let's get into the show. Well, thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast with host Jimmy Hinton.
And Jimmy's mom, Clara.
And again, special guest Christa Brown. Christa, welcome.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So, if you did not listen to part 1 last week, we encourage you to go back and listen to that. It was excellent. So this week, I wanted to pick up where we left off the last time, Christa. And I want to talk about the database a little bit, because you've been pushing for a database for a long time to identify genuinely, I don't know that there's probably not a proper way to put this, but credibly accused pastors or people who spent time in prison. They were convicted and they're on the sex offender registry. You've been pushing for a database across the Southern Baptist churches that would identify who the predators in the pulpits are, so that at least people can be informed. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, that's a fair statement. And so it's been 14 years, almost exactly. I first started advocating for that in August of 2006. The resistance to that, the stated resistance, has always been that somehow it violates local church autonomy. I mean, this is what has consistently been the resistance. And, to that, I just think it is very, very sad that they are exploiting and distorting a legitimate doctrine of polity in this manner, and because it renders faith itself complicit in these things, in these systemic institutional cover-ups. And it is a bogus rationalization that has left a dreadful trail of destruction in countless lives.
And continues to do so.
And continues to this day.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes no sense. The bottom line is information, the provision of information, does not intrude on autonomy. If anything, it can provide local churches with a resource by which they can more responsibly exercise their autonomy. I
don't mean to interrupt you, but this analogy comes to mind, and I use this all the time with churches. And I say, what's astounding to me is I don't know of any human alive, any rational human alive who won't protect not only their own physical property, but their neighbors' physical properties. In other words, if on my street there's been a bunch of break-ins and that's consistent, and windows are being broken and people are sneaking into people's homes and burglarizing their homes and their vehicles and whatever, I don't know of any neighbor on my street who's going to hesitate and appeal to autonomy or appeal to, well, they haven't been tried in the court of the law, or appeal to whatever. They're not going to appeal to those things. They're going to say, hey, there's somebody breaking into homes. There's evidence because there's broken glass everywhere. There are things missing. They're destroying physical property. We're going to knock doors and we're going to let our neighbors know, right? Because that's an act of compassion, to warn your neighbors, to say, this is happening on our street right now. What's amazing to me is we all get that with physical property, but with children and their souls and the amount of carnage that's left behind when little people are sexually assaulted and victimized over and over and over and over again, all of a sudden, we can't do anything about that. We can't warn people, you don't believe in grace, you don't believe in forgiveness, all these cliches that we hurl at people. It's asinine, and it makes me livid that we will protect personal property, physical property, but we won't protect children in the church.
I think it's basically inhumane. I mean, mammals, it's not even mammalian. I mean, even mammals will protect their young, and not only their own direct young, but the young of the herd. I mean, this is just a basic mammalian instinct.
Sure.
And we aren't doing it. And I hope someday when we are all looking back at this, or maybe I'll be gone by then, but when others are looking back at this, I hope people will remember this, because I basically think what the Southern Baptist Convention and its leaders are doing by asserting local church autonomy as the reason why, oh, woe is us, we can't possibly do anything because we believe in local church autonomy. They are basically using it as a risk management strategy to minimize the risks of legal liability for the institution. And I hope to God that one of these days people will look back on this and will not forget it, because they are making a choice. And that choice, they are choosing between risks. And they are choosing to leave a greatly increased risk of being sexually violated by clergy on the shoulders of children, rather than taking on a potential risk of legal liability for themselves and dealing with it. And that's the choice they're making. And I think it is absolutely a perverse ordering of priorities, and it is unconscionable.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting too. We come from autonomous churches. So, the Churches of Christ, we're we truly are autonomous. And, I've heard the same arguments within our religious tribe. And I think it's fascinating because we have, especially at the SBC, they have other blanket policies that include all of their churches, women in the pulpit. That's a prime example. That applies equally. It's written in policy, it's written in stone. And so this whole notion that they're appealing to the autonomy of the church, and we can't mess with that. We can't even, our hands are tied. We can't create a policy that goes across all the autonomous churches because that messes with autonomy. It's bogus because they're doing it with other policies.
It is bogus. The churches are networked in a host of ways. I saw a recent study where they had, spent denominational dollars, and so this is cooperative fund money, to have a big study so that they could advise churches on what the salary ranges should be for pastors of different size, depending on the size of the church. They could spend denominational dollars on that so that they can advise churches on how to appropriately compensate their pastors. And I've got no problem with that. That's good. But if they can do that, why can they not also spend money to have an independent and professionally trained, available panel who could assess credible allegations and advise churches on whether this man is fit for ministry? The church can then do what it wants, and then the denomination could disfellowship them, but they could offer that information and do it in a cooperative way and fund it that way.
And by the way, that's a merciful thing to share that information.
Yes,
that's extending mercy. Both, ironically, it's extending mercy both to vulnerable people, including people who are already victims of any kind of sexual violence. It's an act of mercy to them, but it's also an act of mercy to the person who would abuse more children. To say, hold on, we're putting the brakes on. We're going to shine if you truly are repentant, first of all, you'll resign from the ministry yourself and never enter it again. And secondly, you'll stay away from kids forever. And you'll say, I did this. I'm guilty. I did it. I own it. It's wrong. There's no excusing it. It's an act of mercy both on vulnerable people and on the abuser to shine a light on that and say, this is what they did. This isn't speculation. It's what they did. And we're not doing it.
That's right. That's right.
And I don't know why. I don't know why it's that complicated. And that's what, I mean, in my wildest dreams, I, as a parent, as a church leader, as a Christian, as a human, I can't comprehend circumventing a public registry. Like, these are people who are already convicted. You circumvent that and say, well, we're going to keep those records hidden. We're not going to let people know. In my wildest dreams, I can't comprehend any rationale behind that.
No.
I just can't. So I'm gonna kind of stay in this gear, I guess, and talk about Megan and Dominic Benninger, because they started a database. And interestingly, I don't know if you know this, but I had consulted with their church. I was contacted by one of their deacons, and that's how I got to know Megan and Dominic. And that ended up being a big, there was a big national story on that. An investigative journalist wrote an amazing story on that. The church had hired a pastor, and that's here in Pennsylvania, Camp Hill, Pennsylvania. They had knowingly hired a pastor who was a sexual predator, a convicted predator.
Convicted, yeah.
And there were only like 2 people in the leadership who were in the know. And they hid it not only from the church, but they hid it from the other leadership. And so I was contacted by one of the deacons, and he said, "Hey, would you consult with us and help us out?" And I said, "Yeah, gladly." They were ridiculed. In fact, the Benningers were they were harassed. People were stalking them. People are leaving things on their front porch, like boxes and, random things that just to make them think that it was a bomb or, things like that, really bizarre things. The amount of harassment they experienced throughout this whole process was horrific. And so they were a little bit naive on the front end. And I don't want to speak for the Benningers, but, Megan and Dominic have spoken pretty openly about this, but, they also, like you, they believed that the church leaders would hear me pleading with them, saying, you need to be transparent with your church. Like, I laid out a list of recommendations. I said, if you lead well, your church will not only hold together, but you guys will come out much stronger on the other side. If you hide things, if you lie to your church, if you cover for this guy, I'm telling you, there's going to be a church split. And things are going to get ugly really quickly. Guess which route they took? They took the wrong route. Right. There was a church split almost immediately. It's been a complete train wreck. Everything that I told them would happen. So anyway, all that to say, Megan and Dominic were absolutely incredible from start to finish. They were warning church members. They were telling church members, hey, this guy spent time in prison. He's a convicted child rapist, on and on and on and on. They ended up starting a database for the Southern Baptist Church. So what do you make of that, number one? And are you, because I've not talked to you about this, were you excited when you saw somebody take up this baton and kind of run with it?
Oh my gosh, yes. Yes. I kept a database for 6 years, and I just flat out physically could not do it anymore. I just couldn't. I was thrilled when Megan and Dominic decided to do this and talked with them about it, of course. Obviously, I think it's something worthwhile. And I'm so thrilled they're doing it, and they're in my heart and in my thoughts and in my prayers every single day, because I know how hard it is.
Yes.
And so I'm very, very grateful for what they're doing. At the same time, I really want to be real clear that, what they're doing with the Baptist Accountability Database that they're doing, it does not in any way let the Southern Baptist Convention off the hook. It does not in any way moot the need for the Southern Baptist Convention to institutionally take on this responsibility for itself. And let me talk just a little bit about why I feel so strongly about that. Right now on Megan and Dom's database, they show 360 criminally convicted Baptist clergy predators.
That is unbelievable.
And
I guarantee that's not even scratching the surface.
No, exactly. And only 63 credibly accused. Now, we know that ratio should actually sort of be weighted the other way, because the majority of pastors have not been criminally convicted. All experts say that criminal convictions are the tiniest tip of the iceberg. Even the Southern Baptist Convention's own experts, Ministry Safe, I'm no fan, they say that,
I'm with you. I have to be careful what I say, because I work with Grace, so I typically don't say anything publicly, but I'm with you.
But these are their own experts, and they say that only about 3% of all child molesters ever encounter the criminal justice system. So if you do this math, and even less, so they encounter the criminal justice system, even less have convictions. But so I'll stick with the 3%, because that's their own number. If you do the math on that, then if there are 360 who have been criminally convicted, then that would mean that there are probably as many as 12,000 who could be credibly accused if there were a process and a system for assessing those allegations within the faith community. And I think that speaks to how enormous the problem is and why it really needs to be addressed institutionally with a full-time paid professional staff to assure that credible allegations are professionally assessed, assures due process for everyone, and to keep records on them and have a system for sharing that information. That number sounds astounding, and I think that's a very fair estimation. And if you wrap your mind around that just for a little bit, just a sheer number of people, and these are not people who were in the pulpit, these are people who are in the pulpit. These are people leading churches right now. Right. And
none of these, I would say probably exactly 0 of these people ever have only one victim.
Right.
If for people who are statistical people, I'm one of them. To the best of our ability, and the numbers fluctuate all over the place, but on average, these people have upwards of 100 plus victims before the time they ever get caught, if they ever get caught. And rarely do they get caught. So you're talking 12,000 times, roughly 100 victims each. You're talking thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of victims who are out there right now.
That's right. And the harm not only to the victims, but their families, it just trickles down. The devastation is terrible. And the fact that they don't address it, it's horrible. We can't know exactly whether that 12,000 number is accurate, precisely because they don't keep these kinds of records.
Sure.
But I think it meshes with what we know from other contexts. There was a recent article that was published by a Baylor law professor, and he quoted a statistic that somehow he got this study that 70% of Southern Baptist ministers know of other ministers who have, and this was their term, committed sexual misconduct with a congregant. 70%. So if you imagine, do the math on however you want here. 100,000 pastors in the Southern Baptist Convention, 70% of those know a pastor who has committed sexual abuse. That's 70,000 pastors who know of someone.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, they're certainly not being encouraged to speak up about it.
No, they aren't. And there is no structure or system by which they can readily do that either, to facilitate that.
Yeah. Well, I know.
I'm just sitting here and I'm taking this all in from a perspective of an advocate, perspective of a wife, former wife of an abuser, a minister. And, from the perspective of a mother who has had her own children abused. And when you hear these numbers, Christa and Jimmy, it's so easy to become detached unless your family, your child, your home, your son, daughter, whomever has been directly affected. And I think so much of the time these leaders and I hate to say this, and Jimmy, if you want to edit this out, go ahead. But the preachers, it becomes like the good old boys club. I'll cover your back if you cover mine, because after all, and then they get into it, who hasn't had some kind of misconduct at some time? And I think a lot of that happens. And after all, like your dad said, Jimmy, really, was it that bad? Yes, it was that bad. Yes, it's horrible. It's devastating. The ramifications are lifetime. The effect it has, the profound effect on a person's spiritual well-being, on their spiritual health, on their relationships, both with God and with family and others. It's horrible. But I think, it's so easy for people to sit at a well-kept conference table and listen and think, oh, these numbers are just outlandish, and just be very cold to everything.
Well,
very cold.
Yeah, to piggyback on that too, Mom, what they do and what I see over and over and over and over again is that we have this really rancid theology. And it sounds really good because, what are people in my profession? We're public speakers. We know how to speak. Mm-hmm. We know how to talk. We know how to sound good. So you have people who are really eloquent, who are really good at making things sound really good. And so we have these toxic theologies that are just absolutely rotten, but they're spun in a way where they sound really good.
Twisted. Yes. Yes.
And so one of the things that we do, and we just talked about this recently, part of this theology is to weigh the good versus the bad and to say, but look at all the good that they've done. Yeah. We could maybe acknowledge that there were some, and then we sanitize the language, some misgivings, some misunderstandings, some sinful behavior, but look at all the good that we've done. Whereas you see Jesus's theology, he's not weighing people by the good and the good versus bad. He's weighing them by the fruit. What is the fruit that you produce? Who are you? That's another way of saying that. And I talk about wolves a lot. When Jesus talks about wolves, he calls them ravenous wolves in Matthew 7. Jesus isn't talking about behavior. He's not talking about what they've done. He's talking about who they are.
The heart.
That's why he uses that language. And they are wolves.
Yes.
Yeah. And we're so afraid to use that language. And so we have this rancid theology where leaders will come back from the very top and they'll say, yeah, but look at all the good that this brother has done. Yeah. You saw it with Daryl Gilliard. Yes. Look at how he was drooled over.
And still is to some degree.
Look at the church growth. Look how many people this person brings in to the church.
Yeah, look how well they can grow it. Yeah, they can grow this big church.
Right.
They can take this little church of 100, this struggling church, and turn it into a church of 1,000. Look at all the good they do. And it's just that it's such a bad theology, and bad theology leads to bad practices, unfortunately.
Well, I still say, and is look at the heart. And Christa, in our first session, you talked about that. This abuse doesn't just happen. It's very intentional. It's very well thought through.
Yeah.
It's very well planned. It's every step is thought out. Every word they use.
Wolves are cunning creatures.
Yes.
Wolves are very smart.
Very smart.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
And they
Yeah.
blend in really well. It's
Yes.
what they do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Claire, piggybacking on what you said, I just, in all the years I've been doing this is when everything else in my whole psyche just abandons me, when I just think, I cannot comprehend, I can't do it. What I always come back to, I'm a mother. I am a mother, and that is always where I that is the solid core. There is no way that any of this can be right. There's
absolutely, right.
And that's where I always come back to.
Right. You are so right. Yes.
Well, Christa, I want to ask this last question. And I know this is going to sound like a loaded question, and I hate getting this question.
Jimmy.
So I'm going to pass it on to you so that I can share in some of this. Are you hopeful that this current culture of hiring and hiding abusers in the church will eventually change?
Well, I would say that, I think by nature, I tend to be a hopeful person. If there was ever anything that would just kick the hope right out of you, it is the Southern Baptist Convention. Nevertheless, perhaps for no reason other than it's by my basic temperament is what I'm saying. I don't blame anyone else for not being hopeful.
Sure.
I do believe that a faith group that so devalues its children cannot endure. And so I think it is ultimately inevitable that they must change, whether that takes 5 years or 10 years or 100 years. I think they must change or they will wither and die. And of course, the dreadful question is how many more kids will it take?
Yeah.
And as far as the hopefulness, where does the hope lie? I mean, it's kind of incongruous. It's counterintuitive. But as strange as it seems, and as awful as it seems, I think the hope resides in the terrible, terrible truth of survivors' stories and in the cumulative courage of so many survivors to tell those stories. And it is not because, I don't believe, it is not because the truth will ever force this faith group, the leaders of this faith group, to do the right thing for the sake of doing the right thing. I don't believe that. Yeah. Not anymore. But by survivors continuing to tell their stories and mustering that courage, I believe it will continue to draw media attention, will eventually draw a great many more lawsuits, and will draw the attention of state attorney general offices to investigate, hopefully the way they've done with Catholics similarly. And those are the things, that sort of outside pressure that I think will eventually compel them to convert, to an ethical practice of prioritizing the protection of kids and congregants.
Yeah. I think that's very well put. And, I also hold out hope, and that's certainly not superficial hope. I've seen more people in the light of Me Too and Church Too, who are coming forward and speaking up very publicly, unashamedly. You used to be on this lone island, and I think now there are several people who are on that island with you.
Yes.
It's still an island.
I'm so happy that. Yeah.
I have friends.
Yeah.
But I look at some of the powerful voices of survivors, and I think 2018 was a huge tipping point. The Larry Nassar case that happened the same month that Jules Woodson came forward with her story, and that that just shone a huge light.
And such a powerful voice.
Yeah. So I think a combination of those things, just survivors being emboldened by other survivors to tell their story, has been a tremendous help. And I think you're exactly right. The truth will not cause them to do the right thing because it's right. But survivors telling their stories is going to force their hand, and it needs to be. It needs to.
And I think
to be.
survivors like you say, no more.
Yes.
No more. This will not continue like this. No more. We are protecting our children. We are doing it. And the Jimmies and the Christas and, of this world, you're speaking out and you're standing firm. You're not wavering. And I love that so much. That's our hope. That is.
Tell me something, you two, if you have another minute or two, because it's what I've never been able to understand. All of these Southern Baptist leaders, these men, most of them are fathers. Why? Why does parenthood not compel them?
Yeah. My answer from what I've seen, I don't know if you have a different answer. My answer can be summed up in 3 words. I don't know. I will never comprehend it. I think people have been brainwashed by their own toxic theology, where that becomes their bizarre new reality. And I heard a pastor once at a church that I'd done a training at. His own daughters had been abused, and as adults were just not doing well. In fact, when we were there visiting at this church, he was telling a story of one of his adult daughters, and she was not well. Physically, she was not well. Mentally, emotionally, she was not well. And it was her grandfather who had sexually abused the girls. And so this pastor said, if I could dig up his grave and raise him from the dead and set him on fire, I would do it today. Okay, so probably a proper response, proper rage for what had happened to his daughters. When I talked about keeping sexual predators from coming into the over the threshold into the church and protecting our children, he said, I can't stand with you on this one. That same man, he couldn't wrap his mind around this idea. He said, because of grace, I can't stand with you.
I was just going to say, Jimmy, I knew it. So
I think it's a theological problem, and our theology matters. And we've got our theology really, really wrong when it comes to identifying abusive people who are legitimately wolves, who masquerade as children of light in order to steal away the souls of our children. And until we get our theology right, we're going to keep seeing it.
I just think we have a hard time understanding that level of evil. We really do. I pictured you as a young girl on fire for the church, for the Lord, for Jesus, and this pastor coming and spouting verses at you, abusing you in that manner also, using you, abusing you. And I'm thinking, wow, just it is hard for us to understand that level of evil. That's all. It truly is. It really is. And yet it exists. And it destroys. And until we get it, we won't have people protecting our children as they should.
Yeah. Well, Christa, you keep hammering them on the database and on making right decisions. I will keep hammering churches on theology and recognizing abusers and dealing with them. And I think as we all work together, it's really going to come down to forcing their hand where they have to do what's right, because people aren't going to tolerate this forever. Right. They're just not. And I hold out hope. I think there will be continued change for the good within the church, but it's anybody's guess what that's going to look like in the process. But I think we're going to come out the other side looking much better. So again, ladies and gentlemen, This Little Light by Christa Brown. I encourage you to go out and purchase her book if you have not read it already. Christa, it's been an absolute honor and pleasure to have you.
It sure is.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure too.
Wonderful.
Absolutely. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in, and we'll catch you next episode.
Thanks again for listening to today's episode. Thank you to our patrons who make the podcast possible. If you found it helpful, please follow on Spreaker and search for the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast in your favorite podcast app. Be sure to hit subscribe and rate the show. If you believe in what we do, consider supporting the podcast by becoming a patron and check out the cool rewards our patrons receive. Share with your friends and tell the world. Join us in speaking out on sex abuse so we can change the tides and prevent abuse.